Hi, everybody. So, Shameela, are you there? I think we're going to start and then everybody can just join.
Here.
Shameela, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me, Colleen?
Yes, we can do. Thanks so
Great.
much, Shameela. So thank you all for joining us. We're just going to kickstart and just everybody else that can join as we start. So thank you all for joining us. Shameela, thank you so much for being our speaker this morning. Shameela's had a long-standing relationship with Business Engage, all the way from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange to where she is now CEO of the NBI, and she's going to be talking to us today on, is net zero by 2050 possible in South Africa? And if so, is it socio-economically viable? It's work that she's done with NBI together with Business Unity South Africa and the Boston Consulting Group. Shameela, over to you to take us through today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you for the invitation, and it's great to be here. And also a warm welcome to everybody joining us today. I know that this is quite a heavy topic for 8 a.m. in the middle of the week, but I'm glad that you're with us. Colleen, could I just maybe get an indication of how many people we have online?
We've got 12 people online, but there are a number that are dialed in via telephone, which I can't see, Shameela. So yeah, and as I said, we still got people joining.
Wonderful, thank you. I also will have joining me with me today my two of my team members. Alex McNamara is my acting head of environment, and Geeta, who is one of our program managers, a consulting program manager to us, who will also be here to help with questions, given that they have a long history with this particular piece of work that we're talking about. So, Colleen, just by way of introduction, and again, warm welcome to everybody online. This topic that we're talking about today is one that is of enormous relevance for South Africa, and I think in its entirety to the economy and the sort of changes that we know are going to need to happen. And I'm going to sketch out for you a little bit about that in terms of just context when we're talking about this. And the reason I wanted to speak a little bit about this is because we do find that we're in a position as a country where we know we have serious challenges in relation to just poverty, inequality, unemployment. And, when you talk about sustainability and you talk about context, it's very difficult to talk about context without considering the challenges we have as a country. And given my background, from where I've come from in sustainability, but also at the JSE, looking at markets and those perspectives, you really need to understand this operating context. And when you're thinking about your business strategies, they cannot be devoid of the context in which we operate. And these are some of the key issues. Within that, of course, is the fact that we're faced with, I think, one of perhaps the biggest crises we've ever had, and effectively is considered to be an existential threat. And by that, I'm talking predominantly about climate change, but also completely related to that is the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in. And when you're sitting in business and, many of you are aspiring board members, for example, and you're considering your duty in governance, not actually paying full attention to this context in which we operate. And for example, the consideration that, growth into perpetuity is the aim of a business needs to understand, is that growth even possible in the finite context of a set of planetary boundaries in which we operate? And so when we talk about sustainability and when we talk about economics, we need to consider a full systems perspective. It's not an easy concept to fully get your head around. When we go to business school, we're schooled in, kind of, you've got your corporate finance, you've got different elements in marketing, you've got strategy. But how often do we stop to think about the fact that even if you're looking at growth year on year, that growth is premised off a functioning ecosystem? And how much attention do we pay to that functioning ecosystem? And so our perspectives are often quite siloed. And that is the way in which we've grown up. And effectively, we haven't really been schooled in understanding the externalities that we create as a function of the businesses that we do and the way in which we operate and those things which we aspire to. And so whilst that's a lot to take in at the beginning, I understand, I want to look at that to some extent in the context of our own country and the transition that we face. For most of us are fully aware that we are in a context where we have a coal-based economy effectively because of the fact that most of our energy is generated from coal-fired power stations. that this emits a huge amount in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, and that globally we have a responsibility to start reducing the fossil fuel emissions at quite a rapid rate if we want to avoid the impacts of large-scale global warming. Colleen, please, I'm going to pause for a second. There's quite a noisy air conditioner which I need to switch off.
That's perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. And so the work that I want to really cover today is an overview of a piece of work that was done through the National Business Initiative with Boston Consulting Group, and of course endorsed and supported by Business Unity South Africa. So very much a business community kind of driven piece, but was a multi-stakeholder piece of work. And what it attempted to do was to understand, we're talking about these global negotiations. We're a country that is sitting with a very different context to, for example, a global north, and where there's economies have already made their money and there's massive social security nets and things like that. And we're in a very different space. And so I think the temptation is there to be able to say, but we're different and we can't do what everybody else is doing, and that shouldn't be what's expected of us, and we should just continue to, for example, use our fossil fuel base because that's what we have as a natural resource. And whilst those are all very credible points to make, the reality is that we also as a globe have a responsibility, because we're also sitting on a continent that, in terms of the modeling and the climate science, is already locked in to experiencing between 2 and 4% higher than whatever the global average temperature change ends up being. So we know that the global aim is to keep global warming ideally within the range of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so we're already locked into some of that in terms of what we've seen already in the climate impact the effect of climate change that we've already seen around the world. And so our continent will look at anything between 2 and 4 degrees higher of wherever that global average ends up. That has very significant consequences for the felt experiences. So when we look at physical climate change, physical climate risk, there are serious consequences that we're looking at. And so to be part of the global responsibility to look at that, but also understand the impacts we're likely to face and the cost of doing nothing becomes very important for us as businesses. To understand how it is that would affect us is important, but also what options do we face? Because if we're able to start exercising some of those options now, as you will see from the research, we have a very real opportunity to fundamentally shift our economy to be net jobs positive and to change effectively the felt impact of many of these things, also to be able to protect those in our communities and societies that are the most vulnerable. When you're sitting in a context of poverty, inequality, unemployment, South Africa, I think youth unemployment already sitting at around 60%. And generally, I think the number sitting at just under 40% for unemployment. These are serious consequences, which also then means that one's ability to adapt becomes severely limited because you're sitting dealing with poverty and all of these issues. So if you think a simple thing, let's just take not such a simple thing, actually, a flash flood hits an area. And we've seen that, for example, in Joburg and other areas where you had a flash flood hit a township, and, you have informal dwellings getting washed away and people losing all their possessions and belongings. The most vulnerable, the least able to adapt are the worst affected. Those of us living in suburbs, having a fairly comfortable life, okay, we might be, if there is some damage, fine, inconvenient, but insurance might, pick that up and be able to help you in sorting that out. What does a person sitting in an informal dwelling do? What does a person who is not employed do in situations like that? And so there's this collective responsibility that we have to try and shift some of those risks and to mitigate them to the extent that we can. So, Colleen, that's a bit of a long introduction, but I will then get into the substance of the presentation. So a bit of a quick background and an overview. This slide is probably already familiar to many people, I think, in the room. And please forgive me because this is from the 23 report. I just used our presentation at the NBI. I haven't updated for the RIPS 24 report, but you're not going to see a massive difference in these risks. So this is the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, which I think has become a little bit more of a common feature for corporates now, and I've seen it referenced a lot more. In my past life at the JSE as the Chief Sustainability Officer, I have been using the report probably 4 for the last 7 or 8 years, because my previous role was in strategy, and this was quite an important thing for me to do. But even in that time, and I consider it like in my lifetime of kind of 10 years at least, looking at the way in which these risks have moved in this table has been really, really interesting. So if you look at the 10-year view on your right-hand side, and this is the likely impact and severity of the risk over 2 year and a 10-year period, if you look at the one on the right-hand side, it's been interesting to see over that period how anything related to what is considered your environmental and your social risks, so what one would largely consider within your sustainability landscape, have moved up this agenda. The top four, just look at the color coding, are all green related to environment. So green is environmental risk, as you will see from the key at the bottom. Red is social risks. So your top five are sitting in the E and the S space. Very, very interesting. Involuntary migration, number 5. That could be from a number of different reasons. That could be conflict related, but also climate related. The issue of climate refugees is growing. As certain areas become uninhabitable or very difficult to live in, people are going to have no option but to go and find other places to live. And so we are going to see the consequences of this. And if you reflect on what I said earlier on about what we're seeing for Africa in terms of the climate modeling, we can expect that this would be disproportionately we would be disproportionately impacted by issues like this. And the top 10 there, your failure to mitigate climate change, your failure of climate adaptation, natural disasters, extreme weather events, these are the ones that are sitting in the top 10 risks. So, for those of us sitting online and listening today, I think I would urge you to ask yourself, even from this perspective, how is this being considered in your organization? And how much of that delving into that science and education, in fact, of your board, of your executive, of your leadership team is there in relation to these issues that are fundamentally now, in our risk landscape globally and that are considered to be our top 10 risks? And then just the 2 year view, I mean, look at this, what we're seeing. We're going to see looking at impacting, at least in the shorter term, your cost of living crisis moves right to the top. But think, when we're looking at issues like climate change and mitigation and adaptation to this and building resilience, does that not exacerbate this? And the next slide, which is really the interconnectedness of the risks, I think brings home that point. So if you look at the interconnectedness, these things are not considered in isolation. So one thing can very easily exacerbate another thing. And we're sitting with what is quite a complicated set of risks to consider and not an easy set to navigate. And so the need to start dealing with that at a systemic level and the real causes of it becomes, I think, immediately apparent for all of us. And I think the collective responsibility then becomes hopefully more obvious in terms of the fact that we can't say you did this or you did this, and therefore I'm not going to do my fair share. I think we need to do it within the context in which we can operate, but there has to be an acceptance of a common responsibility. I'm actually at this point sitting in Istanbul speaking to you, and I've just yesterday attended a sustainable finance conference. And, one of the speakers who works globally across the said that effectively the fight for climate change and biodiversity crisis is going to be won or lost in emerging markets. And we're very much a part of that. So whether we believe that or not, and how far that's true, I think it was quite a strong observation to see. And so this responsibility of us that are emerging and want to grow, it's going to be a question of how we grow and the choices we make. And the choices that we have are actually a really viable set of choices that we do have, but we need a greater awareness that these things exist. And I think to be concerned and to consider it of the fact that there are certain rhetorics that serve certain communities and serve certain factions that kind of, are used in a way that is not factual in terms of that, we can't decarbonize, it's going to be to our detriment. There's a responsible way in which it can be done. The fact base is telling us that, and I think one needs to always have, I guess, a healthy questioning about some of the facts that are often presented to us as, as obvious, but are not actually the real agenda. So the context and background on South African perspective, I've covered some of this already overall in the introduction, but effectively telling us that, the science stresses that the need to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and that is to avoid catastrophic climate change. And some of those impacts I've already articulated to you. And those impacts, I know we're talking about the increase in natural disasters. We've certainly seen that, the frequency of these has increased, but not just the frequency, also the duration. And that becomes exceptionally difficult when you're trying to manage risk. and has multiple consequences in relation to how you manage it, the cost of doing that, just being able to predict some of those things, and we'll see some of those stats as well a little bit later. So we know that there's the stress need for that. Limiting global warming to 1.5 does require staying within a carbon budget. And for those of you that say, I don't know what all of this means, it's fairly simple if you think about it from just a budget perspective, any budget, right? This is all I have to spend. That's it. That's the limit of that I have. In relation to carbon budget, it effectively means that to keep an ecosystem stable, there's a maximum amount of carbon dioxide that can be admitted into the atmosphere that a natural regulation cycle can manage. If it exceeds that, is when we start to see all the consequences of that, because it effectively starts destabilizing an entire system. And actually, that system is the one on which we depend to live. And that regulates a number of the natural functions that we have and that are absolutely critical to our survival. So we need to limit the cumulative within that. And the carbon budget has been calculated for the globe and says, right, to be able to keep within that carbon budget, we can't go above a certain level of global warming. And so we need to understand that. There's also then the concept of fair share. So just like within a company budget, you have a number of different divisions who have access to a certain amount of this total budget. It's a similar way is that we can look at that either at a sectoral level or a country level and say, okay, given your population size or whatever the case is, this is your fair share of that global budget that you need to try to keep your emissions within. And so if we can do that as a globe, then we can have a good chance of being able to keep within this 1.5 degree warming limit. So we know that what we're seeing is as a consequence of human activity. There's obviously a natural variability and natural availability of carbon in the atmosphere, but it is our fossil fuel burning and human activity that has pushed us beyond the boundary of what is in that natural cycle. And so being able to start clawing back on some of that and changing, for example, our energy mixes to be able to reduce the carbon dioxide and then be able to, still continue to live, and we have the energy we need, but from alternate sources that are not as polluting and that will keep us within the carbon budget. So we know the significant physical risks that we're expected to face as a country. I'm not going to go through these. I think that's quite evident there. Your rising temperatures, your shifting rainfall patterns, your more extreme temperature events, all of which, as you know, will have consequences, whether it's for how we farm, the crops we have, the availability of those crops, where we can live, what's habitable, what's not habitable, and just this complete change, right? Where you could farm in a certain area and certain crop before, it's just not possible. And how do we adapt to that? And what does that mean in terms of the type of food, the strains, the crops that we have? Also, of course, one of the big things is the expectation of the increase in vector-borne diseases. And so that has another set of consequences. So there are a number of physical risks that we face. Then from a trade perspective, and this, of course, if you don't want to care about any of those things, and you worry about money, this is the one that you need to look at. South Africa does face significant trade risks. So we've got many countries, including our key trading partners, and the EU is actually South Africa's largest trading partner, have set their own ambitious net zero targets. And so are applying their own strategies and policies as a country to reduce their emissions. And that includes, for example, things like border tax adjustments. So if you're exporting into some of these countries, and the most notable one right now is the EU, and of course, there are a number of other countries that have already put in place plans and have indicated that they will start looking at putting in things like border adjustment mechanisms, effectively means that if you're exporting to that country, and that's just one measure, right? You're exporting into that country, they will look at the embedded carbon content in your product. So you produce this product in South Africa, you got your energy from the grid. The grid is 80 to 90% coal powered. So the carbon footprint embedded in that product is high because of the type of energy used to actually create that product. And so that's calculated. And when it lands at the border, it'll be okay, what are equivalent carbon tax in our country versus what it is that you're bringing in here? And we will apply that. So you might have a carbon tax, but if it's not close to ours, we will adjust accordingly and put an additional tax so that it's comparable to the way businesses in our country operate and what we've considered to be the price of carbon. And so that then becomes an additional cost on the landed good in the country and could render it completely uncompetitive once actually arriving at that border. So what does that then do to those sectors that are manufacturing and exporting there? that could have a serious consequence, right, on those particular sectors. And we'll see some of those numbers later. There are industries immediately like heavy manufacturing, for example, that will be directly affected. And so there are, of course, some discussions going on because there's a whole nother set of conversations about whether this is fair in terms of trade practice and negotiations. And so we'll hopefully see that some of that might change slightly. But the fact is that other countries are saying, we're committed to this, we want to do this, and we can't allow other goods into our country because that's effectively then saying someone else can pollute and send it over here. And so these are the things, and there's a whole question around fairness and trade policy, of course, but these are some of the things we need to be aware of that potentially could impact us. And then if we look at these net zero commitments, and you'll see if all of these countries, at least, and this is a start, and there'll be more that would come on board here, have committed, what does that mean if you're trading with them? What does that mean in terms of the extraterritorial implications of their policies? You could have investors that are based in these countries that are looking at you and saying, well, we have this set of things that we need to achieve. You need to conform with this. And we might not invest in you if we don't see that you're serious about doing this. And so there are consequences that are multiple in that regard, whether it's policy from investor perspective, whether it's things like border adjustment mechanisms. So it's very important to understand that this can start shifting, that landscape for us and in terms of how we trade. So if we look at it, I mean, this is a quick view of key export markets like the EU implementing those carbon border adjustments, and many others will follow. So if we look at that and we look at, the different countries and what that looks like, you can start to see this picture of if we're trading, if we're looking at being a small, open global economy, then these become serious consequences for us. And this is just looking at some of the volumes of South Africans export to leading partners in 2018 in terms of billions of rands. And you can see, yes, let's look at this one. This is already looking at a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the EU, and that's 226 billion, China 113 billion, the US 84 billion. All of these are looking at, so they have either net zero target or looking at implementing those. We do see this landscape shifting to and fro a little bit, and others might drop off slightly and others come up slightly. But I think the picture that this is shifting and will have a direct impact on trade for our country, I think is effectively the takeaway from that. Our vulnerability is particularly acute, like we've said, because of the commodity trade balance that is open to this, what we call transition risk. And transition risk is really bad risk that we face in different ways as a consequence of the development of policies by and large in other jurisdictions. So we look at that and you can see all of the commodities here could it start affecting that price cycle. We know the commodity price cycle then has direct consequences on those businesses. We've seen that recently in some of the platinum group companies. We've seen job losses, for example. And yes, there is a vulnerability to the pricing and the commodity price cycle, but to the effect that these commodities are ones that we use and that can, that we sell, and that could also be then impacted by carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for example. And just, because of the content and the role that they play in some of those products, we can start to see that from our own economic structure, this can become quite pervasive, perhaps in ways we don't immediately think of. When we looked at the modeling as well, I mean, here you can see some of this is coming directly from Stats SA and Minerals Council of South Africa, and also our joint project teams, looking at about 60% of jobs in the mining sector at risk. Platinum group metal and coal mining regions in the north and northeast, that I think Mpumalanga, of course, is a hotspot in terms of coal mining and the coal value chain and the jobs in there. And you can see that it's not just about the jobs there, but it's about what about the jobs in manufacturing that one stands to lose if we don't decarbonize. And then you've got those in the coal value chain that we need to look at as well. But on average, because we're looking at 5 to 10 kind of dependency on each job is critical. And so we know that the need to preserve jobs is critical, but also that there's a whole economy that we need to think about, and what does that mean? So this one, heavy manufacturing sector doesn't decarbonize. We know we're looking at risk of about 50%, 170 billion of export value. And this points to the what I mentioned earlier on about some of those that are directly impacted and what that could mean in terms of losses. So whilst in one hand, when we talk about the transition in terms of energy, we often focus on the losses just in the coal value chain. There's also losses for not decarbonizing that are sitting in other parts of the economy. And so what are the best pathways forward for a country like South Africa that needs to consider both? So what we did in this piece of work is say, let's go try and get as many stakeholders as we can to be able to start thinking about that and saying, what could this mean for our country? And what does that mean for just transition and for net zero? And what could such a shift look like? And so that's the work that we undertook. It was a 20-month study to develop a pathway to just energy transition in South Africa and what that could look like. Sorry, just a second. So we wanted to answer the questions about what's the cost of inaction, and I'm hopefully have sketched out to you that there's a serious cost of inaction as well, of not responding to these critical global economic drivers, and what it would take for us to get to net zero, and what would be the socioeconomic implications of that. We were not looking to be able to say we need to set a new ambition for South Africa, for example, and by when, and definitely not prescribing sector company specific targets, for example. So I think please let's dismiss that up front. This is really a knowledge base and this is publicly available. I urge you on the NBA website, and I'll ask one of my team online to please post a link to the Pathways documents if you haven't already. But it's really interesting reading. It's written in a way that's accessible and will be something that you could use. And I think really gives you an informed fact base that has been a multi-stakeholder approach. We had CEO champions, I think about 30 CEO champions that signed up to champion this piece of work. It consulted with around about 400 different stakeholders across business, government, and civil society, who all had input into the process and the development of the reports. And could, in terms of the CEO, certainly, their teams for every single report were given those to be able to comment on and to give feedback on. And so quite a strong governance process around the production of this piece of work. Multiple sectors, lots of intensive engagement, number of working groups across different sectors. And again, like I said, the stakeholders. So if we look at those, and those are the individual pathways reports, which you can access on our website, as I've said. I'm not going to go through too much detail on the governance. Let's just go into the substance and what were the key findings. So this, I think, is one that, it really needs to sit with us for a little bit. South Africa cannot sit idle, and we definitely need to act now. We do face a uniquely difficult starting point, and I've mentioned some of those. We are one of the most carbon intensive economies in the world, and we're facing increasing risks. I think even pre-COVID, we already economically were in a bind. We had an economy that was struggling. We then had to come out of a COVID era that had its own consequences, and now need to look to where does this growth come from in our country. We also, as I've mentioned, one of the most physical, exposed to physical risks. And we know by now that more of the same is just not going to work for us. The need to transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy is going to be critical because it also hopefully helps us become more competitive globally. Because if most of the other countries are doing this and we kind of sit still, we effectively are not going to be competitive. And that has consequences for all of our businesses and for every single one of us who are dependent on those for our pension funds, for our growth, for our well-being, for our livelihoods. And so it needs to be just. I mean, we are sitting with these issues of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So we need to ensure that that future economy is socially resilient and inclusive. And so the process that we undertake to achieve a just transition is very, very important. There has to be an explicit consideration of how does it be inclusive? How do we ensure the just element of the transition? And at the end, I'll just go through some of the concepts around justice and the framework for just transition that was put forward by the Presidential Climate Commission. So we know that we need to ensure that the communities and workers that are exposed have to be at the center of that transition. For those of you that, for example, have ESG strategy, some of you might, for example, have had a look at the JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance. Under that pillar on E, there is definitely a few indicators that are looking at the just element of the transition. At least start having the conversations with the communities that could be impacted with your stakeholders. We know the cost of inaction is massive. I've given you some of those numbers already in terms of the loss of export value, direct jobs, percentage of GDP, if we don't decarbonize. And we might then also lose the opportunity to capture green industries and adding to existing, socioeconomic development in a way that is meaningful and that is inclusive. So looking at where the future needs to go, where the future is going is part and parcel of business. Every strategy team looks at this. You want to look to where the opportunities are. You want to look to where growth can come from. And we have these potential opportunities as a country sitting there, but we need to know that there's a fact base that supports that. And then this is what the emissions sort of trajectory looks like at a sectoral level in terms of the contribution to our fair share of carbon budget, which is sort of a 9 gigaton carbon dioxide level, cumulative emissions 2020 to 2050, and what is possible. So that would kind of be the breakdown per sector in terms of that carbon budget. And of course, all of this might mean nothing to you if you're not engaged with this daily. But I think hopefully just the bigger picture in saying that there is a fair share that's broken down by sector is helpful. So the findings in short were that it does all hinge on renewables, and we can address 60% of our emissions reductions through bringing online renewables. And there is a process for that. And of course, there's a place for baseload, and there's a space for transitioning, and there's a space for coal in that pathway. But being able to say we need to build and we need to start building at scale now. We already might be too late in some instances, but we have that opportunity. This is what it can look like. So when we look at that in terms of the fair share, you can see the key at the bottom, the dark green being renewables, and other mature tech levers that we can look at, and some of the tech in early adoption, and seeing what that looks like across the different key sectors and the energy intensive sectors within the economy. And the research really came up with this, and I won't go into detail. We have a shortish time today, but really to say, if we look at it, this is kind of that we can do it. There's a cost initiative and there's a whole costing that was done behind that. The modeling work that was done with BCG was using the Plexus model, which is what is used by Eskom to be able to do that modeling. So it was very specific to South Africa. It wasn't a global necessarily view. It was looking at what the lowest cost tech is and doing a lot of detailed modeling on that used in South Africa's context, and came up with saying that kind of, a big build in renewables is really the big one we need to look at. And there are certain intermediate kind of fossil sources as well that would be useful. And so that transition is really operative in this sense, but it's about how quickly we do it and how committed we are to doing it, and to say it is possible. It will be net jobs positive, and it will help us to become more economically competitive in the longer term. So these were sort of the key actions to keep that trajectory alive that the report came out with. So we want to enable a rapid rollout of renewables, and then it gives you some of the numbers there. By 2030, we're sort of looking at 30 gigawatt, which is double what was currently planned at the point of writing of this. Now, the new version of the integrated resource plan came out in December, and although that's not the final one, we'll see once that's been revised after public comment what that looks like. So I'm not going to comment on IRP for now, but this was obviously based on the previous planning in terms of the integrated resource plan for the country. We've also subsequently have the renewable energy master plan that's come out. So I don't want to go into those policy documents, but this is kind of what we look at. So if we look at this, it's almost a view to assess kind of what those other plans are potentially looking at. And so rolling out renewables at that 6 to 7 gigawatt per annum, which was 10 at that point, 10 times the current rate that we were looking at. And interestingly, in about 10 years of the renewable energy independent power producer program that some of you would know we had in South Africa, which was by and large considered to be a fairly successful program, brought about 6 gigawatts in effectively that 10-year period. And we're saying we kind of need that per annum, to be able to get to where we need to get to. What was really interesting, though, is that in the period after we had the removal of the cap on self-generation within the country, that was part of the president's intervention in terms of a crisis and energy crisis that we were facing, we actually saw effectively that same amount come onto grid as what had happened in 10 years in just after the cap was lifted. So it was there. Private sector really came to the party and put up a lot. Yes, a lot of that was just ensuring energy security for their own businesses. But the fact is that it allowed for that to come onto grid, which means that there is a pent-up opportunity to do that. We're also seeing, of course, now that we've seen a lot of home solar come up. The challenge, of course, is that those that can afford to do it will. What happens then to those that can't? And that could further effectively, marginalize people in terms of access to energy. So the need to be able to do this in an explicitly inclusive way, in a very mindful way, then becomes so important. But it also is encouraging to see that these are accessible, and business would not be investing in it if it didn't see, firstly, that there was an opportunity and that it was viable. And of course, there was necessity in this regard, but that long term, we know that the business cases are saying that this is actually positive to do. And so those are some encouraging signs we've seen effectively subsequently to the study final results coming out. So we need to look at the structural advantages. There are certain industries that we absolutely can have a global advantage in. Green hydrogen is one of those. But we need to move quickly to create that enabling environment from a policy perspective, and a number of other things that need to be done to unlock that opportunity. So these are new industries of the future. And these I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to zoom through a little bit to the end, because I did say to Colleen I wanted to chat for about half an hour, and I think we're kind of 39 minutes in, and then pause to take any questions. So these are the sort of key things that we need to do to be able to do this. And like I said, the reports themselves in detail are available on our website if you want to understand the modeling. What does that mean? Where do those numbers come from? These are, and so they are there, and these are that really take at the top. Densifying some of our urban sprawls to increase their density and key transport access to reduce travel demand. So effectively saying, how do we have more effective transport systems so that we can actually move people en masse? We don't have one person, one car on the road, which just becomes increasingly difficult from an emissions perspective, but also just the use of resources, right? And we know that all of that needs to shift if we want to get to a greener economy. How do we do that? What are the critical changes that need to happen in our country? Electrifying our road transport, this new energy vehicles is a big thing that we need to look at as a country, too, from our own consumption perspective, but also because we're a manufacturing hub for a number of internal combustion engine vehicles. But those vehicles are also being exported into markets who've set net zero targets, who've actually, in some instances, already got policies banning internal combustion engines from a certain period, 2025, 2030. So if those are in export markets, and we're not necessarily manufacturing to be able to meet that change, then we stand to lose even more. And so that has been identified, and I think there are some moves afoot, at least to start looking at the motor industry, for example. So, but this is the other side, which is our own usage of electric vehicles on the roads. What can we do? How does that, what does that mean from an infrastructure perspective, public charging points and things? So we need a plan to be able to start looking at decarbonization. So we've got the energy sector being the largest contributor in terms of our own carbon profile, and transport being the second largest. So increasing the use of private versus public transport. Then, of course, diets, right? Just what we eat daily. I think there has been an increasing awareness of this. And, there's somebody who's kind of either going vegetarian or having a meat-free Monday, but really looking at that shift away from sort of red meat driven diets to lower red meat diets. But also then there is the consequence that often to keep to a nutritious diet is actually more expensive in many instances. So what do we do? How do we deal with that where we on the other side are saying, but we have a challenge with poverty? So these are things that we need to really start considering. Action now is going to be critical, because a number of the things that we mine in this country are what is within the critical minerals kind of spectrum. And that means those that are going to become very important in the green transition globally. And so can we access our own commodities in that transition more quickly before it just becomes too expensive to do so? And so we need to be able to be strategic about mining what we have, about leveraging that to transition our own economy quickly and actually get ahead of the game, because it's possible. But there has to be an intent to do so, and an awareness by businesses that this is a massive opportunity, and therefore can they actually lead in being able to do this. So those are some of those. This is just going into detail on some of the transport net zero transition, the costing on that, sorry, and the infrastructure costs and what that will look like. And I'm happy to sort of share this with you later on. And also what was really interesting is that when we looked at the cost of what that would mean and the infrastructure costs and all of that, about 60% of those investments in the 2020s are commercially viable. And that is always critical, because you can we can do all of this, but if it's not bankable, it's not commercially viable, then what's the case to do that right now? And if we have to wait for international support and climate finance and all of that, might become difficult. There are things we can already start with that are already commercially viable, that are opportunities to begin with. And so that is a space where we can work together. We can look at the policy enablement that needs to happen, different things that happen to say these are sort of winning bets if we can get our act together to get them done. And so these are some of the ones you could look at. Obviously, grid infrastructure investment, some of that's been looked at now with the transmission company that's been started to sort of, look at the separation of the ESCOM concerns around generation, transmission, and distribution. And then some of the money that we need for the different tech, like green hydrogen, will be mostly concessional money. But this says a lot to how we can access some of the global climate finance that South Africa has access to. And some of this is reflected already in the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that was launched in December last year on the critical areas. The other area very quickly is going, and you can have a look at this, but is on skills. So you can see that the transition is possible. You can see the opportunities happen, but the skills needed to be able to do that is going to be a critical component. And here I'm going to, Colleen, do a quick punt for the NBI, but has been given the NBI has been given the official endorsement by the presidential, by the project management unit in the presidency that's overseeing our Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, for us to lead the private sector coordination of green skilling. This project was launched last week. We have had 26 CEOs sign up to support that, and that is effectively saying, as private sector, what do we need to do to get our skills to be able to move the dial and to move quickly on being able to achieve this? So on the different key areas there, you can see what we need to look at. There are impacts on balance of payment, fiscal health, where are the risks, where do they sit? These are interesting considerations, useful ones for business, and you will find more detail in the report as well. So I'm not going to go into the interplays on all of this, but there are certainly actions that we need to consider. There are things that are there. There are certain, political interference, misalignment, that, commercial realities versus our real world challenges that we have. But once we know what these are, we can start, having, I think, useful, helpful conversations on shifting that. And so, Colleen, I think I'm going to leave it at that, not go into more detail. But of course, if they want me to, I'm happy to do that. But I'd rather pause and then I think take the questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shameela. Are there any questions for Shameela? And Paul, I see your hand.
Hi, Shameela. Hi, Colleen.
Hi, Paul.
Thanks a lot. I think quite insightful. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you fine.
We can hear
yes.
you, Paul.
Lovely. I think quite insightful. I will go through the report. But I just wanted to understand, I think for me, I think it's great that South Africa is taking on this stance. What always fascinates me is around just the trade policies, and I think we know historically in terms of the balance of power and the fact that with industrialization in the first world countries is also mainly what's caused this. And so you've given us a detail around the possibilities of gain in terms of economically and jobs. What I wanted to just understand is that in terms of just negotiating national determined contributions for each country and stuff, how have we fared, and is there a view where we would then maybe increase what the industrialized countries need to contribute so that it becomes fair and equitable? I think from an Africa perspective, you mentioned that from a physical risk perspective, we then in South Africa specifically, we are facing the highest risk. So while we are doing what we need to do, I think the first world countries need to do way more. So I'm not sure, and this is really fascinating. I'll be touching base with you after to just get into it some more.
And Paul, I think great question, and it is definitely, a valid question, and certainly has been, I think, at the heart of our position as a country, right? We're going in saying, and so just let me start with this. The last set of nationally determined contributions that we went to at COP 27, which was the last one is not COP 27, COP 26. And so we went with our NDCs, and I think you revise your NDCs every 5 years. So we went to COP26, not committing the country to net zero by 2050, but we went with effectively a range, right? And we said at the upper end, and we had one that said, okay, we're not going to be within our budget, but this is what we do. But on the lower band that we were offering was certainly within the Paris Agreement and was 1.5-degree aligned, but we were very clear that it was dependent on the adequate financing, tech transfer, and support, which are the mechanisms that is within the agreement that we need to have. Now, we do know that historically, many of the promises in terms of climate financing have not been met, and that is a reality. And that flows from those industrialized or developed countries to be able to do exactly what you're saying, which is to support us in the transition. So South Africa went with a very progressive position that said, we want to do it. Here's what we can do. We've done the numbers, but we need you to give us the support to be able to do that. And so we're showing our side of that, and we can do it. And so we do that. So I think the position going in on negotiations often is the right one, in that there is this within the negotiation, the language of common but differentiated responsibility and relative capability. And that is critical for any emerging market like ours. So we absolutely have to hold that ground when we go in. But at the same time, internally realize that not decarbonizing makes us uncompetitive and it's actually shooting ourselves in the foot in this other context. So looking at that. So we need to make every effort we can, because actually it's the way our economy can grow, and we can preserve those jobs and grow our industries and things like that. But in the international negotiations, to be very clear about the fact that there is that responsibility from the global north, I'm using that loosely, but to give us that support and to be able to do that. And some of that has come through already in terms of the just energy transition. We've got the JET platform, that 8.5 billion that was promised to the country at that COP, for example, is nowhere near enough, but at least it's a start. And if we can start channeling that, and the investment plan for some of that money was what was launched in December at the last COP. And so that's publicly available. And so that I encourage people to read if you're interested in that. But so absolutely, we need to be holding the line in the international negotiations, but ensuring that we are doing what we need to do in our economy immediately. Because if you look at countries like India and China, who sometimes I guess we consider to be competitors, but also trading partners, you might argue China is committed to net zero by 2060. But if you look domestically at what they're actually doing, that's effectively just cover. The transition is happening fast. They are locating themselves as the global manufacturing hub, in terms of solar panels and things like that. And so what does that do for us? And we're a country sitting with some of the critical minerals that need to supply into that. What are we doing about being strategic about these things, and beneficiating here? We know the beneficiating conversation. I mean, my goodness, I did my MBA 20 years ago. I'm that old now. But it has been a conversation forever, but now there are different things that I think we need to look at in that regard. So there's a whole set of considerations in that report. I know there's not a direct answer, but there's pieces of all of what you're saying, which is so relevant within that need to be considered. And so I also want to pause and ask, I see Gita and Alex on the line. Maybe I could ask one of them. Gita, do you want to maybe weigh in a little bit about South Africa's negotiating stance and where we are with that, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. Thanks, Shameela, and thanks for the question. Shameela, I really think you've covered it. I think that was a great answer. I think a lot of that common but differentiated responsibility sits within the Paris Agreement, and South Africa has often taken the stance in the negotiations that the Paris Agreement needs to be supported and needs to be upheld. And sometimes what we see in the negotiations is developed countries trying to push agreements that are almost beyond the Paris Agreement or that undermine the multilateral system. And so South Africa's stance in those situations is always to go back to the Paris Agreement and to kind of hold that line. Because, for example, I know last year and the year before there was a big push on fossil fuel phase out by certain dates for developing countries, but I think those kind of additional agreements that are signed in the papers that emerge following the COPs don't necessarily have that common but differentiated responsibility language and the strong call for support sitting behind them. And so, yeah, South Africa is always really pushing for those for a multilateral approach to kind of ensure that the means of implementation are secured. But to your point, Shameela, I think the 9 gigaton budget for South Africa is probably our best share contribution, and it's kind of what we can potentially do. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of resources to kind of implement. But I think the PCC has also done some further research around, sort of looking at different scenarios. If South Africa aims for achieves our NDC and aims for net zero versus if the world doesn't, and then they looked at if the world goes to net zero and South Africa doesn't, and then they looked at scenarios where both go for net zero or both don't go for net zero. And what they found was actually the best scenario, ironically, for South Africa is that if we go to net zero, but the world doesn't, because there are enough markets for us to then sell our renewables and our fossil fuels. But there is still the problem with that scenario then is there's still sort of massive climate risk, which then whatever sort of benefits you gain economically, you're then paying out in climate damages and reparations. So really the ideal scenario for us is that if we all go to net zero, even in the context of common but differentiated responsibilities. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. And I see Retabila made the point about green skilling. Absolutely, 100%. And I think, to support the Paris Agreement, but also to support our base case in terms of, building our own economy to be competitive and relevant going into the future. Maybe check for any more questions.
Are there any more questions? There we go. Ruth.
Hi there. I'm going to put on my camera and hopefully I don't get shut off. My Wi-Fi is not so great today.
Great, we can see you, all of you.
Good. Shameela, my question is more around what does the green skilling look like? You made that, you said that the government made a pronouncement that you'd be leading it as NCI, but what does that look like? I don't know if you've got a view at this point, but maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Okay, certainly. So Alex is also online. Alex, I'm not sure, Ogita, if you have the presentation on green skillings by any chance on hand. But, when we're talking about green skills, we're obviously looking at firstly some of the priority sectors in terms of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. So that would be in your renewables, the full across the different types of renewable energies, obviously, and the skills that would be required in that. The green hydrogen, also electric vehicles, for example. So looking at those priority sectors that have been put into that, and those would effectively immediately be that. When we're looking at this, renewables will be the big one because you saw the build requirement, right? So there's a whole shift that needs to happen there. There would be in the entire technical skill set there and different levels in terms of the skills would be required from kind of your lower level jobs right up to your very highly skilled in terms of whether it's the engineers or whatever the case is that runs those. So there's a whole spectrum, and generally they're related to the priority sectors in the transition. So what would be required in renewables across the different types and across the different levels, whether it's installation, whether it's manufacturing, whatever the case might be. And then similarly for green hydrogen and for an EV sort of setup. So happy to hear from my team on the line if there's any more specificity. But Ruth, that's just the short answer to kind of what we need to look at. And like I said, it's going to be different skills. And then if I had to reflect on, for example, the different working groups that we've set up now in looking at the green skilling piece that we've just kicked off, it also includes, for example, the critical minerals and looking at that, because even in the mining sector, for example, you're going to see we might shift out of coal, but then are there new skills or different skills that might be required, for example, in the critical mineral set? And there's a couple that might be in there. So it's quite detailed. The ecosystem mapping is what the first phase of the work is going to entail, and that's the work that's kicked off now. And we should have the first set of recommendations on that, including what, for example, skills development zones will look like by the end of the year or into first quarter next year. So that ecosystem mapping, firstly, what the transition look like, what kind of skills skills are going to be needed? Where will they need to be located? Because there's also a location issue, right? And Mpumalanga is obviously sensitive because of the core value chain. But as we start moving away, we might not be able to create new jobs in exactly the same area for all the same people. There's those kinds of shifts that might need to happen. New industries need to be set up, new economic kind of activity away from those dependencies. That's the one thing. So there's the upskilling and there's the reskilling elements that will be in there, as well as just the new skills, dependent on what is required if we look at what those transition new economies are going to look like.
Thanks, Shameela. I see Geet has also added some comments here as well. I'll read through that now. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's fine. Yeah, and so the JET IP has that whole chapter in the investment plan on skills, and that's also a useful reference point. So we're largely following that in terms of what the skills will be needed. But of course, the benefit that we get is that because of the way the working groups are, we have direct private sector engagement on what is known as demand-led skilling, to be able to say, okay, you're an employer potentially in the economy and would need certain skill sets. What does that need to look like? How do we ensure that the education system and what's coming out of it and is actually suitable for you, and that you can find that you're able to actually get the skills you need? Because right now, this we've got graduates coming out that are unemployable in some instances. Yes, there's just a lack of jobs in some cases, but some of them are coming out with skills that are just not relevant to what the economy needs. So how do we work together to ensure that this demand-led skilling says that we know where the demand is going to come from and we're getting the right skills to meet that demand, but more importantly, that we're changing an entire education system to be fit for purpose for our future, because private sector honestly will find what they need when they need to. If you're in this business of manufacturing something or the other and you need a certain skill and you're in renewable energy, you're going to go find that skill, but the chances are you're going to pay a lot for it. You might have to import it, when the opportunity really is to reskill our own people to be able to meet that demand. And so we can have a far more inclusive kind of shift in that way by being very intentional about it. I see a question: create a strategic alignment between business, government policy, and our education sector. Absolutely, in order to build capacity. So, Cecily, I think I didn't read that, but I think to somewhat I've sort of hopefully answered some of that. And that's exactly that we've identified those as being some of the issues. The NBI team that's leading the piece of work on the green skilling, obviously it's going to be a coordinated piece across the private sector, and we will ensure that we constantly feed back to government and are part of the government kind of structures as well. Is going to be so important. So there has to be that strategic alignment. And first we need to agree on what those priority sectors are going to be, and then ensuring that we can help to shift appropriately the whole education system. Currently, the NBI works directly with a number of TVET colleges, and that's an immediate opportunity also because of where they're located, right? And so that you can really make a direct impact into some of those communities by just shifting what happens in some of those TVET colleges, but also concurrently build an SME ecosystem around it that can actually be effectively part of the supply chains into some of the businesses that will be created around, the new economy, but also not necessarily just be supply chain, but themselves be businesses that can be built up. So what we're also looking at, this is going to a bit detail, but is creating hubs at those TVET colleges that are hubs for SMEs also, and people within the communities to come and get some of those entrepreneurial skills and get the right qualifications and understanding to play a meaningful part and be included in the transition and the opportunity for the jobs that will come as part of that. Retabile, thank you for that comment. Yeah, so fingers crossed. And if anybody is interested in, participating in some of those working groups, please just reach out to us at the NBI. We can share those details with you. I think if they're relevant to your sector, you're welcome to participate. And of course, always open for comments and where you're seeing opportunities, and share that with us, because this is really a whole economy transition that we're looking at. Hi, Malcolm.
Hi, I'm Shameela. Hi, how you doing? I don't know if you've just seen in the chat, Cole's just had to go and take another call, so I'm going to finish off for you now. So are you all finished now? Is that you? Is that all your comments?
I don't know if there are any more
Anybody
comments
else
or
got
questions?
anything for Shameela? No, then just
Alex
just
has
to
his
let
hand
you
up.
know,
Sorry,
everybody.
Malcolm. Alex has his
Sorry,
hand up. I think you might
sorry,
want to
carry on.
comment, Alex.
Sorry, Malcolm. Can I quickly abuse my fact that I'm in the room, if you don't mind?
Sure.
So I'm just thinking about the overall question about, is net zero possible for South Africa by 2050? I think the short answer is that yes, it is definitely possible. And a lot of it is actually commercially achievable and socially just. And I think it was probably underemphasized a little bit that how critical the role of renewable energy will be as this low cost, low risk alternative or way of developing our economy, improving energy security, addressing water scarcity in its own right. And that sort of is a pivotal moment and a way to diversify the economy. And from there, the kind of economic opportunities that will flow from it. I mean, I think Shameela spoke a lot about the costs of inaction. And we often think about the international climate change politics as the kind of this focal point, and that is understood for a reason. But there is this economic shift that is happening, you know, as Shameela mentioned, whether we like it or not. And we kind of have to respond to that. And at the same time, we have some of the best renewable energy resources in the world. And despite sort of policy uncertainty, international investors and renewable energy companies that are clamoring to get access to that, and related industries that really could thrive if we get that right. So, I mean, Shameela mentioned that China is becoming the solar manufacturing hub of the world, which is what it is. India is becoming the wind manufacturing hub in their own way, in their own right. But if you have a strong renewable energy sector in South Africa, we will achieve a level of localization. It will just make commercial sense for renewable energy companies to start to localize some of the value chain. So that will bring quite highly skilled, highly paid jobs. And then if you look at the value chain of renewable energy, it is extensive and upstream and downstream. So there's a whole kind of economic transition that if we don't take advantage of, we will miss out. And then we'll miss out on the future economic opportunities related to electric vehicles and green hydrogen, which are supported by renewables. So that's why quite a lot of the work focuses on that, and the fact that actually these are commercially viable investments based in a country with some of the best renewable resources in the world. Thanks, Malcolm.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Alex.
Alex. Thank you. Okay, anybody else got anything before we close? No. Okay, just to let everybody know, the next session is on the 15th of May. If you go to the Business Engage website, you'll find all of the details there. And you will be able to find a recording of this session on the Business Engage YouTube site. So, yeah, anybody who wants to go through it again, then you'll find it there. So, Shameela, thank you very much for your time. Nice seeing you again. I haven't seen you for a while.
Thank you, Malcolm.
And everybody, we'll see you the next time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for
Have
joining.
a good one. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.